David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren, who is running for president as well, has released a plan for how to pay for Medicare for all. And we're going to go through it and we're going to break it down. But we do need some important context in order to do this correctly. One controversy around Elizabeth Warren and Medicare for all is that there's a criticism of her that she's not really for Medicare for all at all, but that maybe she's open to it along with lots of other ideas, which are actually the ones that she would pursue. And if that's true, then that is absolutely a concern. Now, lately, I'm seeing her talk more and more about how Medicare for all is the way, being more and more for it, even in supposedly leaked behind the scenes private video talking to union leaders. She still was talking about how Medicare for all, she believes, is the way to get the most care to the most people, the most cheap, in the most affordable way possible. So that's number one. And certainly putting out a plan for how to pay for it is a good sign that she's taking it seriously. Second piece of context, there are questions specifically around the cost of Medicare for all that I've brought up. Medicare for all can still be the best plan. I still support Medicare for all. But at the same time, if there are unanswered questions, if there are real criticisms of it, not dumb ones like the U.S. has a lot of people, so it wouldn't work. That's a dumb criticism. We've already talked about that. There are real criticisms. And on the left, we want to be prepared to address and deal with those. Now, I know that there are people on the left who will say, but David, nothing on the right ever has to be perfect, and they do it anyway. So why does everything we do have to be perfect? It doesn't have to be perfect. And in fact, it's not, and it may still be the best thing and the path most worth pursuing. But we should not pretend that these questions don't exist because we want to be equipped to answer them. So to remind you, the problems with most of the prior plans for how to pay for Medicare for all are mostly twofold. Problem one is that many of the plans that say, here's how much it'll cost and how we pay for it, they are assuming a drastic reduction in healthcare costs in the US to the levels of Australia and Canada, which are about half of ours, in order to make the numbers work. But they don't say how they would do that. They say we will do it, but they don't say how. And the reality is that the health insurance bureaucracy that we have does add cost to the system. So if you get rid of that with a Medicare for all system, you do shave some of the cost, but only a little bit of what you would need to shave in order to cut the price of our healthcare delivery by 50%, which is what Australia and Canada have. If you can't explain how to do that, the numbers don't work. That's a problem with a lot of the plans that are out there. Number two, the other issue is that a lot of the plans for Medicare for all include these phrases that nobody in the middle class is going to pay more in the net, but we've not seen the middle class defined, and you can get pretty slippery with that. And then lastly, there's also the question of, would Elizabeth Warren or anyone else's plan make private insurance illegal as an industry, or would it simply say, let whatever happens to private insurance happen? If people want it, okay, it'll probably go up in cost as people get out of it. And that's it. And I tend to favor that. I think that it's legally difficult to say this industry can no longer exist anymore. So I think as they like to say, the free market solution should be applied. If hundreds of millions of people get out of private insurance, I think the problem will sort of solve itself. Okay, so let's look at Elizabeth Warren's plan for how to pay for Medicare for all. Now, as we look at this list, understand that lots of this is controversial, and I'm not going to hide that from you. First of all, Warren estimates the cost at $20.5 trillion in additional spending by the federal government over 10 years. This is much lower than what the Urban Institute analysis says. They have a very detailed projection which says it'll cost $34 trillion additional over 10 years. That alone, like if that's true, if the cost is really 34 instead of 20 and a half, that already makes Warren's math completely wrong. Now, there's already some confusion about these numbers. On the one hand, she says it'll cost $20.5 trillion. But on the other hand, she says on her website that it's a $52 trillion over a 10-year plan. Which is it? It's sort of both, and this is confusing, and it relates to the fact that some of the existing costs paid by consumers would instead stay in the pockets of consumers, but then there will be new spending that has to make up for that which is what they call additional federal spending. But the idea is either way, the baseline is 52 trillion over 10 years. In one case, the government is in the middle, and that's what needs to be additionally funded. Now, if you look at the savings that Elizabeth Warren lists, or where she would pay for where the money would come from to pay for this additional spending, she says 8.8 trillion comes from employers. Instead of paying health insurance premiums to private insurers, they start paying the government through a payroll tax. That's 8.8 trillion. 2 trillion comes from taxing the investment gains of the top 1%. 1 trillion comes from a wealth tax on billionaires. 800 billion comes from taxes on financial transactions. And then 6.1 trillion is contributed by the states. That adds up. And then she also, is assuming drastically lower costs, which we're going to talk about in a moment. These numbers add up if you believe the additional spending is 20.5 trillion instead of the 34 trillion, which the Urban Institute says it will. And that gets us to the assumptions about lower prescription drug prices and reducing administrative spending, but more importantly, reducing what we pay for healthcare, period. And this is where her plan falls short. This is not unique to Elizabeth Warren. She assumes that healthcare costs will, number one, drop to be much closer to those of other countries, and number two, grow much more slowly than anticipated. You have to defend those assumptions because they are huge, complicated things. And as yet, she doesn't appropriately defend them in her plan. This is not me being a Warren attacker nor a Warren shill. This is me just looking at the data and the criticisms. If you look at Elizabeth Warren's plan on her website, it is assumed as a foregone conclusion that healthcare spending drops drastically and rapidly and almost immediately when you switch to Medicare-for-All. I already told you in my general analysis of how to pay for Medicare-for-All that serious experts, even experts on the left, say that these expectations are unrealistic. There are estimates that in the best of cases, it could take decades to tamp down healthcare costs in the U.S. to make 20.5 trillion a realistic number. A more realistic number is 34 trillion, as cited by the Urban Institute. So to be completely frank, this is a fine plan. It's not drastically different than most of the other plans that we've seen. And it's a problem is it counts on drastic reductions in healthcare spending that cannot be assumed unless you explain why is the Urban Institute and other economists that have looked at this, why are they wrong? And why is Elizabeth Warren right? Or why is Bernie right about the drastic reductions in spending? Because you can't attribute it simply to changing systems. Simply going from a private insurance system to Medicare-for-All doesn't drop healthcare spending by the 50% it would need to drop to match that of Australia or Canada. All this being said, Medicare-for-All may still be the best plan, even at 34 trillion in additional spending over 10 years. But we've got to figure out how to pay for that. It's doable, but we just have to be honest about the numbers. And this is now the trend, that the proposals that are being put forward for how to pay for it have extraordinarily optimistic numbers about the cost, which serious think tanks and economists simply don't agree with. That being said, Warren being more and more behind Medicare-for-All, that's good. But we've got to resolve this issue because otherwise it either will not happen, even with a Democratic president, or it'll happen and we will be shocked at how much more it will cost, which is also a problem. If we're going to do it, let's do it right based on what it'll actually cost. We've got to deal with it at some point in time, and I hope it gets dealt with soon. Democratic presidential candidate Robert O'Rourke, known to many as Beto O'Rourke, has exited the presidential race. He's been most recently polling just under 2% on average. This is pretty logical. Beto has not gotten traction. Like many other candidates, he's not gotten traction. He's decided to exit the race because he recognizes that, quote, "we do not have the means to pursue this campaign successfully." Nothing to laugh at. He's recognizing something that other candidates are either not recognizing or not willing to accept publicly. Now, Donald Trump immediately continuing with his dog rhetoric, saying that Beto has quit like a dog, which doesn't really make any sense. If anything, it confirms Donald Trump doesn't really know anything about dogs. The dog's certainly not known for the trait of quitting things. In fact, the word dogged meaning having tenacity or persistence, suggests the opposite, although I have no idea. I know that dogged contains DOG, but I have no idea if the etymology is actually from the word dog. Anyway, maybe that's me making a joke. Maybe it's not. If it works, then by all means, dogged, meaning having tenacity. How weird is it, though, what's going on with Donald Trump and dogs? ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi died like a dog, according to Trump. Not sure how many dog deaths Trump has witnessed, maybe something to look into. Beto O'Rourke quit like a dog. Just very strange dog imagery. Now that Donald Trump changed his residency to Florida, the headlines could be Florida man screams at presidential candidate about dogs, and it would be sort of accurate. The upside to Trump using dog as his newest insult is that he's far less likely to misspell it when he tweets about it. I don't think that this is all bad, though, Beto O'Rourke getting out. I have been saying for several weeks, it's time to start trimming down the field and getting some of the people that don't have a shot out of the race. I would love to see Beto O'Rourke specifically, as I've said before, go back to Texas and challenge Republican Senator John Cornyn for his Senate seat. Even if he can't defeat Cornyn, I don't know, maybe he could, but even if he can't, forcing Republicans to have to spend a bunch of money in that race would be a really great thing. And speaking of which, there are several people polling around 2%, the way Beto O'Rourke has been, who should also quit. Delaney is at 0.3%. I don't even know if he's still running. I thought maybe he did drop out. Marianne Williamson's at 0.4%. She should go. Julian Castro, sadly, because I think he's actually a much better candidate than a lot of the others polling nothing, is at 0.6%. Probably time for him to leave. Bennett, again, I thought Bennett was out. I guess he's still in. He's at 0.7%. Tom Steyer at just under 1% is truly an annoying annoyance. Cory Booker and Tulsi Gabbard at 2%. Time to go, guys. It's over. And then Amy Klobuchar and Andrew Yang between 2.5% and 3%. They're probably ending soon, but they can maybe justify staying for one more debate because they are, listen, 3 is not that far from 5, and then you're in Kamala territory. So maybe they can justify staying in. Notably, in the last week, this is just a week, but in the last week, Bernie back up, Joe Biden back up, and Elizabeth Warren down, sort of reversing the recent trends. It's good not to go too far into analyzing the ways polls move in just 1 week, because this is a long race. Currently, we have 9 people qualified for the 5th debate. That's later this month on November 20th. We have Gabbard and Castro pending qualification. If they can get the polling they need, they've hit their fundraising requirements. So that's that. I applaud Beto for being realistic and doing what makes sense, and I would like to see him go back to Texas and at least fight for the Senate seat currently held by John Cornyn. Let me know if you think that's a good idea. I'm on Twitter at @dpacman. Follow me on Twitter. I'm very close to 100,000 followers. And it would be amazing to reach that completely arbitrary and meaningless round number so that then we can try to reach some larger arbitrary round number. Follow me on Twitter at @dpacman and follow the show on Twitter at David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new members of the day are Imelda Lopez and Robert Fugle. Imelda and Robert, thank you so much for being David Pakman Show members. You, of course, are the #1 funding source for the program, and I really appreciate it. Also want to say thanks to today's longtime sustaining member of the day, Teresa Kuo, who has been with us almost 5 years. Teresa, thank you. Join these great folks. Support programs that you believe in. JoinPakman.com is the website, www.joinpakman.com. Coupon code is available. This is 2020 will save you 40%. The level of panic and desperation that has arrived at the inner reaches of Donald Trump's mind hit a sort of climax over the weekend, and we're going to dig into a few of the different ways in which this happened. One is Donald Trump inventing an absolutely absurd conspiracy theory in another one of these wild anti-impeachment outbursts. This one contained the suggestion of crimes for Republicans to commit, also involving Adam Schiff allegedly editing documents from so-called never-Trumpers. And there's so much going on here that you really have to research each element of the conspiracy to even have a shot at understanding what Trump is trying to argue, never mind that it makes no sense. So let's look at it piece by piece. It was a 3-tweet outburst, but I think we're better served looking at it tweet by tweet and really breaking down what's being said here. And what's important is we can't allow this stuff to become mainstream talking points because there's just nothing to it. And very quickly, Trumpists latch onto this stuff. And it's like you can't turn back the floodgates or unring the bell. So first tweet, quote, "If shifty Adam Schiff, who is a corrupt politician who fraudulently made up what I said on the call, is allowed to release transcripts of the Never Trumpers and others that are and were interviewed, he will change the words that were said to suit the Dems' purposes." So put aside the grammatical bastardization of the English language that's going on here and go through assertion by assertion. There's no evidence of Adam Schiff being corrupt. This is straight out of Sean Hannity's playbook. Sean Hannity's the Fox News host and friend of Donald Trump, who's been claiming that Schiff is a corrupt leaker, but there's no evidence of that. Of course, they don't care about evidence. It just makes a nice story. Second, Adam Schiff hasn't made up anything that Donald Trump said on the call. What we know Trump said, because Trump released it in a partial transcript, which Trump thought vindicated him, was actually extraordinarily incriminating. And we know that most of the call was missing from the partial transcript that was released. Number three, Trump talking about transcripts of so-called Never Trumpers. Trump is referring to the fact that there are allegedly people involved in the Ukraine fiasco who allegedly didn't support Trump in 2016, which is most people in the country. Remember, Trump lost the popular vote to Hillary and half the country didn't vote. So like 76, 77% of the country did not vote for Donald Trump in 2016. That doesn't make them corrupt. It doesn't make them untrustworthy. And then again, alleging without any evidence that Adam Schiff will manipulate transcripts, which is a horrible allegation, and there is no evidence of that whatsoever. Second tweet, Republicans should give their own transcripts of the interviews to contrast with Schiff's manipulated propaganda. House Republicans have nothing to do with Shifty's rendition of those interviews. He is a proven liar, leaker, and freak who is really the one who should be impeached. Again, using the false basis that Adam Schiff faked transcripts to then suggest Republicans effectively forge their own transcripts, right? These would be crimes. Trump, I'm sure, if asked, would say, no, Schiff faked transcripts, so I'm recommending Republicans release the real transcripts. This is bogus. If Republicans release alternative transcripts, they would be doctored. They would be what Trump is accusing Adam Schiff of having published, and those would be crimes, okay? And then again, throwing in that Schiff is a proven liar, leaker, and freak, for which there is no evidence. And just a reminder, this is the president of the United States talking this way about other elected officials, high-ranking ones at that. This is a president of the United States acting like a lying, petulant child who is, by the way, extremely unbalanced. I mean, think about it. If you had a 9-year-old and you found out that in school they were behaving this way and treating other classmates in this way, they would be sent for a mental health evaluation. They would be screened for personality disorders. In our case, it's the president of the United States who's behaving that way. And then the third of the 3 tweets in this unhinged rant, Trump saying, quote, "False stories are being reported that a few Republican senators are saying that President Trump may have done a quid pro quo, but it doesn't matter. There's nothing wrong with that. It is not an impeachable event. Perhaps so, but read the transcript. There is no quid pro quo." Well, there's actually a very well-sourced story in the Washington Post which says that it's true. There are Republican senators considering acknowledging that there was a quid pro quo. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to abandon Trump. They will say what Trump is saying, which is a quid pro quo is just fine, which is what Donald Trump also does. Trump says, even if there was a quid pro quo, it doesn't matter. There's nothing wrong with it. And yet again, the transition from it definitely didn't happen to even if it happened, it would be okay. It's not a crime. It's not impeachable. That transition starts to take place. And that's a transition we're well acquainted with in the Trump era. This man must be removed. He must be removed. And the way to do it at this point, still most likely, is just voting him out in November of 2020. So Donald Trump has again, for the second time in 2 weeks, gone to a sporting event in public and just been brutally, brutally booed, this time even more than last week. It's been interesting to observe in a few ways. It's a story about the 2020 election in a sense. It's a story about Donald Trump's bubble that he exists in. And it's also a story about media propaganda, which we'll get to a little bit later on in the segment. So let me catch you up. Last week, Donald Trump went to Game 5 of the Major League Baseball World Series. He was booed. There were chants of lock him up that broke out throughout the stadium. Arguably, it's less surprising at a Washington, D.C. baseball game. Even though baseball is not a particularly left-wing sport as an organization, Washington, D.C. is quite left-wing. It's not shocking he'd get booed, although people do go from more conservative Virginia to the games. But Trump was visibly shocked by the booing that was taking place last week. We played videos for you. You can see Trump grimacing. You can see him being popped out of the filter bubble that he creates for himself at rallies and at the White House with brown-nosing suck-ups all around him. And then there was a media propaganda story that came following it because Fox News cut out the booing from their reports about Trump's visit and referred to it as, quote, mixed reaction from the crowd. So that was last week. Lo and behold, over this weekend, Donald Trump goes to a UFC event in New York City at Madison Square Garden. UFC, of course, is a mixed martial arts league. And once again, the booing just absolutely brutal. Check it out. Here's another one of Trump making his grand entrance. And maybe most brutally is the last one. Okay, I think you get it. So once again, some references to this as a mixed reaction. And of course, if you put 21,000 people in a stadium, you're going to have some MAGA clowns, but it's a very negative reaction overall to Donald Trump. Now, this is why this is so interesting. The UFC, okay? Trump is friends with big Trump supporter and UFC president Dana White. White spoke at the Republican National Convention. He's a big Trumpist. One would expect UFC to be more Donald Trump's crowd. This is not some stereotype that anyone who likes fighting is a Trumpist, but different sports have different crowds. And to some degree, even in New York City, you would expect a somewhat friendlier to Trump crowd to be there at a UFC event. So this could be a signal about 2020. It's definitely a signal about Donald Trump's impeachment, which continues to grow in popularity. But it's also a story about media propaganda, as Fox News insisting once again that people just loved Trump showing up there. Check it out.
You know what isn't pretty also? UFC fights. Yeah. Like these guys are fighting to take it all the way down. The president went to Madison Square Garden last night, watched Jorge Masvidal take on Nate Diaz. The fight was actually called after 3 rounds because of the cut for Diaz. But the president got a big reception. You know, the media can say what they want about it, but this is a crowd that loves this is not a PC crowd right here. This is a crowd that appreciates the brawler style of a brawler president who is there in New York City, the belly of the beast, to watch this fight.
And there are some media outlets actually saying that they mostly heard boos. This has become so juvenile. If you actually listen to the video and the audio, there clearly were a ton of cheers.
So Pete Hedgebath, or I have trouble saying his name, whatever his name is, he's correct in that this is not a PC crowd. And yet they still were mostly disgusted by Donald Trump appearing there. You definitely shouldn't trust the people who 7 days ago edited out the booing at the World Series to tell you if there was booing at the UFC. The videos, I think, tell you everything you need to know. But what Donald Trump really needs to be doing is just go to a NASCAR race. Go to a NASCAR race in, North Carolina or Georgia or something like that. And if they boo him there, he's really in trouble for 2020. I don't know that Donald Trump has any interest in going to NASCAR, but that would be my recommendation to him. Make sure you're following The David Pakman Show on Instagram at David Pakman Show. Clips of the show, poll questions, behind the scenes pictures, including of the main studio, of Pat's lair, of the entire thing. And while you're there on your Instagram app, follow me as well at david.pakman. We will take a quick break and a lot more coming up on this Monday show for you today.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to welcome back to the program Jason Stanley, who's a professor at Yale University, author of the books How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them, and How Propaganda Works, both very, very relevant in 2019. Jason, so great to have you back on.
Great to be back on, David.
So a couple of things that I want to touch on. I mean, one, generally speaking, we explored the idea in your first appearance on the show about how there are sort of very formal characteristics and definitions of things like fascism, but that oftentimes in practice, in ostensibly democratic Western governments, elements of fascistic behavior can sort of creep in. It's not fascism per se, but that doesn't mean that it's not a useful term to explore what it is that we're seeing. How relevant is that as a lens through which you continue to watch the Trump administration since you were last on?
I think it's highly relevant. I mean, what we're seeing is a continued co-optation of our institutions. So we're seeing institutions that are supposed to be independent but are being transformed into essentially loyalty cadres of loyalists for the leader, which is what we see in the devolution and deconstruction of democratic countries in Eastern Europe, Poland and Hungary, primarily. We're seeing our courts being co-opted by partisan extremists. So we're seeing a one-party state develop. We're seeing and it's not just a one-party state filled with decent Republicans committed to a multi-party system. It's a party being taken over by a family and a leader, and we're seeing taken over by partisans of that party. So that is something deeply worrisome. We're seeing that accelerate. The courts are going to be in very partisan hands for some number of time. We're seeing a greater toleration for things that seemed shocking 2 years ago. So ICE, the situation at the border and in the detention centers, we're seeing the normalization of treatment of our fellow human beings. People are learning to look away. And that, of course, is a very disturbing sign of encroaching fascism.
When we talk about the Trump presidency, there are a couple of different views that are still critical, but they're different views that can sometimes be applied. One is that this is sort of an anomaly, and that as soon as Trump is gone, everything goes back to how it was before. For better or worse, we can debate how it was before, but it immediately sort of goes back. The other idea is that Trump now has modified what is considered acceptable for the office of the presidency in a way that will not simply go back to the way it was, even once Trump personally is gone. What does history tell us about that? What are your thoughts about that?
Right. Well, our democracy is held up by norms that even in the best instance are not followed, but at least you have to pay loyal lip service to them. Now we're not paying lip service even to those norms anymore. So we're seeing an assault on truth that is unprecedented. It's not that our government didn't lie to us. Governments lie. Governments lie. That's what they do. Liberal democracies lie to their people. Governments lie. The Iraq War, financial crisis, our racial history filled with lies. But it's something different now. There's a different character to the lying. So in the past, take the Iraq War, there was an intent to deceive. If you looked at the literal statements were not as often lies. They were meant to mislead you, trick you into thinking, Rumsfeld would say, Saddam Hussein is not an honest man. And well, that could be true consistently with Saddam Hussein not being involved in 9/11. And so they were intents to deceive. There's no more intent to deceive. There's just bald-faced, open lying, a direct assault on truth. And so that is very particular to authoritarians. Authoritarians try to dismantle truth and make the public space, information space, just us versus them. So what we're seeing now is they don't believe the things that Trump says, but they think it's our lies versus their lies. There's no reality. There's no cost for lying anymore. And it's just you're with us or against us. And that's anti-democratic because democracy is all about compromise. It's about seeing our fellow citizens' point of view, not vilifying our fellow citizens. So our information space has been really damaged, and I'm not exactly sure how we repair it.
Is that one of the hallmarks of effectively propagandizing by a government or an administration, that even when the followers, the recipients of the propaganda, identify that on the basis of facts what they're being told isn't true, they either accept it on the assumption that there's some greater truth that is implicit, or even sometimes on the idea that the ends sort of justify the means, or that the other people also lie? Like, is that a sign that you are effectively propagandizing your followers?
Yes, definitely. But it's a particular kind of propaganda. All political parties engage in propaganda.
Yes.
So what's tricky is to notice the difference in our information space. The difference is not that people are manipulating audiences with rhetoric. That's just called politics. And so the right do it, the left do it, the Democrats do it, the Republicans do it, everybody does it. But what's different is that there's no intent to make people believe things, believe that reality is different than it is. It's just an attempt. There's no attempt to sort of give plausible sounding reasons. It's just turning the political space into complete us versus them. This is why the subtitle of my book, How Fascism Works, is The Politics of Us and Them. This is what you see when you see the attacks on democracy. And if you can remember if you can put yourself back to the pre-Trump era, if that's even possible for us now, it was a time where we knew that our politicians lied to us, but we also knew that if you caught them, there would be a cost. That's gone. We now have the situation that you used to have, that I would understand from people who lived under authoritarian regimes, where everyone thought everybody's lying. It's all one big lie. You just have to figure out, as you said, who's really deeply on your side. And the distinction between a deeper truth and let's remember, and a superficial truth is one that comes from the Soviet Union. That Pravda is the deeper truth, and so the state might lie in the service to a deeper truth, and that's the emblematic of authoritarianism. If you can remember back to like 2012. 2013, there were real costs to lying. There were real costs to being caught in a lie, because this deeper truth element wasn't there yet.
When we look at some of the different areas you mentioned at the beginning, so for example, Donald Trump doesn't literally control the judiciary in the way that you see in some other countries, but he's responsible for having selected more and more Supreme Court justices, more and more lower, appeal level judges. So it's not a direct control in the cartoonish way that sometimes exists, but he is exerting more and more influence over the judiciary. Trump doesn't literally control the media, but there are some media outlets that are essentially arms of the Trump administration. There are others that, even in their critiques of Donald Trump, are still being led almost by a leash as to what will you talk about for the next 4 days when Donald Trump decides to tweet about A to take your attention off of B. So in looking at all of these different areas that Donald Trump is not in a formal sense controlling, but is increasingly wielding influence over, which is the most concerning to you in terms of its authoritarian direction that it's going?
The judiciary.
Okay.
I mean, the media as well. Both are concerning. But it's more the judiciary, the Republican Party, unfortunately, the moderate Republicans that we remember from times past are fewer and fewer. And the ones that desire power at all costs, a one-party state, complete domination. I mean, we have to remember this president lost by 3 million votes. That anti-democratic elements in the structure of our country, like the Electoral College and the whole system of the Senate, really, that disempower majorities, are at work here. And then we have an assault on voting rights and the Supreme Court validating extreme partisan gerrymandering. So at some point, you have to ask, in what sense are we a democracy, or even there's always, we're not a democracy, we're a republic. What sense are we anything but a one-party state? And the judiciary has been now filled with very young, far-right, many of them partisan hacks. And so when you look at the literature on authoritarianism, they always warn you about a one-party state. And if you look at our judiciary, what we're seeing is a lot of partisan hacks, a lot of people who are not trained at elite institutions, who are basically from, not that the elite institutions have always led us in the right way, mind you. And of course, the Supreme Court and the elite institutions are part of the problem. The Supreme Court on the right and the left, on whatever ideology, they're all from Harvard and Yale.
Sure.
But we have a lot of unqualified justices and people who are just really, really partisan. And so that deeply concerns me. It's flying under the radar. These are people who are going to steer policy for decades to come. And I don't know how much of this can be undone. So I really worry about the guts of our democracy. The voting laws, the Voting Rights Act has been gutted. Partisan gerrymandering has been validated. So if you go back to Jim Crow, what was Jim Crow about but about the voting system? And there's a lot of concerns about our voting system, and the judiciary is really foundational there. So even if you have a fully free press that can say what it wants, ultimately it's supposed to affect the voting system. And if the voting system is not free and fair, then we're going to increasingly have problems.
So if Donald Trump is reelected in November of 2020, which, I mean, I'm not making any predictions at this point, but it's certainly quite plausible, despite, hearing, he's not doing well in North Carolina. Okay, listen, we know that our expectations the day before Election Day are often proven wrong. If he is allowed to no longer have another election coming up, what concerns do you have about what the next level may be in these authoritarian tendencies? Like, what has he not done yet that at this point he could probably get away with?
He's shown a clear proclivity towards using the instruments of power to target his enemies. Bill Barr, the Attorney General, has proven to be a very dangerous person. So the thing is that he's got an Attorney General who seems to believe that the presidency is a dictatorship. And Bill Barr has now opened a criminal investigation on the basis of a far-right conspiracy about how Ukraine supposedly set Putin up.
Yep.
So That's already extremely disturbing, and it's a year away from the election. To open up a criminal investigation on the basis of a far-right extremist conspiracy that Ukraine somehow was setting up. So using the instruments of power, using the Justice Department, he's a very willing attorney general to target political opposition. He seems to think that's completely fair. We already are starting to look like a dynastic banana republic. I mean, he brings his family members are at all loci of power. So, these pictures from the G20 and these other with Ivanka Trump and various other family members. So we're looking already like a family dynasty. We're seeing the Justice Department being used to target political opponents. We're seeing. I'm extremely worried about the ever increasing intensity of the immigration mechanisms, which are sending our fellow residents in the United States into hiding, no mercy at all. And he seems to not be able to find a Department of Homeland Security head who's harsh enough. So I'm worried, and I'm worried about these mechanisms of cruelty being baked into our economy, as you already see in the Midwest, where many county jails rely on the money they get from ICE. So you have really harsh targeting of undocumented workers and residents. So I'm worried that the gloves will be off in a way that even now is hard to imagine.
We've been speaking with Jason Stanley, who's a professor at Yale University. He is the author of most recently the author of 2 books, How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them, and also How Propaganda Works. Jason, so great having you on again.
Great to speak to you, David.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
It's really important in this era of constant sort of political scandal, and in reality, it's almost an era of constant scandal fatigue, not to let the storylines of this administration just fade away without follow-up. And one of those stories is the wall, right? Donald Trump's wall with Mexico, which we now learned can be defeated with a $100 saw available at any hardware store. So remember, Donald Trump promised a wall across the entire U.S.-Mexico border by the end of his first term. Obviously a joke. It's not going to happen. It always was a joke. It was never going to happen. But Donald Trump and his followers are trying to claim that the wall is being built. Trump says it's being built. The truth is that there was previously approved money to repair and replace some aged parts of the wall, and it is being done with the version of the wall that Donald Trump likes or says is, quote, virtually impenetrable. So another element of this is the strength of the wall and the ways in which the wall can be defeated. And it turns out that the wall Trump wants to build is a total farce. It is not virtually impenetrable. It is very easily defeatable. And in fact, border agents and officials recently told the Washington Post that a $100 saw that you can get at any hardware store can cut right through the wall. Some of these rebuilt, repaired wall sections were done with Trump's version of the wall, which has steel bollards and it has a series of 30-foot tall panels. So smugglers have been carrying around a $100 saw and just cutting through the steel bollards, and then you push the panels forward and you walk right through Donald Trump's virtually impenetrable wall, which he called the Rolls-Royce of walls. It sounds more like the Trump Tower of walls, given its shoddy nature. I think that's the better analogy for the quality of the construction that I would use. Now, unfortunately, this is what happens when you let xenophobia blind you and your followers. You end up putting all of your eggs in one basket. In this case, it's the basket of a wall that doesn't really work, and in the basket of obsolete technology that does nothing to address the underlying reality of why people are trying to come to the United States, which is really what we should be working on if we want to solve this problem. but it turns out that it can also be defeated with a $100 tool. Look at any time in history and look at the various ways, the myriad ways in which walls have been defeated. Look at Troy. Look at, I'm forgetting other historical examples offhand, but there are many of them. Now, you can argue the point of the wall isn't that it has to actually be impenetrable. It just has to delay people long enough that Border Patrol can show up. Wait a second. You're shifting the goalposts to say that we're going to spend 20 billion, 25 billion, whatever it's going to be. And it's not meant to stop a $100 saw. It's just meant to delay people so that Border Patrol can show up. Doesn't a river also delay people long enough that Border Patrol should be able to show up in all cases? Because we've already got that at much of the border. The wall is not pragmatic. The wall is a monument to xenophobia. It's a monument to political promises. And it's not being built. That's the most important thing. It is quite literally a boondoggle. And by the way, I'll remind you, it's not just a $100 saw that can defeat the wall. The wall has been scaled and passed over as well. But this is also ultimately not about that. This is an example of feelings over facts. The fact that the wall will cost tens of billions of dollars and not solve anything, the fact that the wall can be defeated with a $100 tool, the facts don't matter. The feeling that Trumpists get by seeing Trump talk about the wall and promise the wall, of Trump being big and strong and powerful, and that it'll stop people from coming in some complete fantasy world, that supersedes the facts. And the people who shout about we should pay attention to facts over feelings are the ones who are being destroyed by their own feelings while ignoring the facts. And yet again, another embarrassment, a $100 saw defeating the wall. The wall is barely a conversation anymore for Republicans, of course, because it was yet another one of Donald Trump's massive failures, but we're not going to forget about it. Here's just a funny little media story. It's becoming more and more popular in some online circles to interject non sequiturs about Jeffrey Epstein didn't kill himself. And you're seeing this on Fox News. You're seeing this online in the meme world. I saw Joe Rogan tweeting some funny memes related to it as well. And Fox News was taking a cue from Donald Trump and doing a segment about military dogs. You might remember last week, Trump tweeted about the dog that was apparently involved in the suicide of ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. And so total Fox clown Jesse Waters said, hey, let me do a segment about patriotic military dogs. So he interviewed a former Navy SEAL who knows about military dogs. And the Navy SEAL blurts out Epstein didn't kill himself when the segment was winding down. And it actually looks for a moment like Jesse Waters isn't even really paying attention to the guest. There seems to be a delay that's longer than the satellite delay that they seem to be experiencing. Here is Warrior Dog Foundation founder Mike Ritland taking a cue from the Epstein didn't kill himself memes and doing it on live TV.
Who's to your left there, and I'm sure he's ready to go out on the next mission, and he can't wait. So thank you and thank Nero for your service. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. If I could I throw a PSA out real quick?
Real quick.
Just the remarkable nature of these dogs and them being highlighted in the news creates a huge demand by people that frankly shouldn't have them. If you see the coverage and you decide I want one of these dogs, either buy a finished trained, fully trained and finished dog from a professional, or just don't get one at all. And Epstein didn't kill himself.
All right. Okay. Thank you for that commentary. All right, Mike. Maybe more on that later. And tonight.
This is starting to get a cult following. We dealt with some of the facts last week. I don't feel that it's necessary to go back into it. It does not seem like this story is going to go away anytime soon. It's particularly popular with the Fox News crowd. But I want to be really clear. The Epstein stuff is not just a right-wing conspiracy theory at this point by any means. I'm in favor of inquiry. I'm in favor of investigation. I want to figure out what happened. If we don't believe the official story, then we should demand transparency about what took place. But what I want to mention to you today, the opportunity I want to take here, is to remind you that all of these right-wingers who believe that Epstein was killed, not that he died by suicide, the right-wingers are missing the rest of the story. They're not closing the circle. Donald Trump was accused of having raped a 13-year-old girl at Jeffrey Epstein's Manhattan apartment. Trump is on video, which we've played for you, with Epstein, evaluating the attractiveness of young ladies in a very awkward-looking situation. If you do believe that there was a plot to have Jeffrey Epstein killed and to have it ruled a suicide in order to prevent the trial from going forward, but you don't believe any of the disturbing and disgusting allegations that involve Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein, then you're missing arguably the biggest part of the story. So I'm with you. Inquire, investigate, seek the truth, look at the autopsy reports, raise all the hell you want. But don't pretend that if indeed there was a plot to silence Jeffrey Epstein before a trial, that it has nothing to do with Donald Trump potentially being incriminated by that possible Epstein trial. You're like 80% of the way there, but you're ignoring the Trump piece, which is allegedly and potentially a really major piece in the entire Jeffrey Epstein fiasco. So there it is. Funny moment on Fox News. We will see if this becomes a trend and more people do it on corporate media. And that number is 219-2-DAVID-P. This is something that's a bit touchy, and I do get a lot of questions about this. It's sort of about like real life hate mail. Let me just play it and then we'll talk about it.
Oh, hi, David. My name is Deborah, and I'm calling from Newfoundland, Labrador, Canada.
Yes.
I just listened to your piece about your latest hatred mail, and I wondered if you'd received any kind of hatred mail that was criminal.
Right.
And or you had to act on it. In the meantime, I just wanted to say thank you for all the great work you're doing. I think I'm going to use that coupon code. I think it's Hatred40.
Yes, indeed.
And get myself a second one. We will keep the Hatriots crying. David, thanks so much and take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. I appreciate it. So listen, the question, is there ever hatred mail or hate mail that we get that we would consider criminal? The answer is yes. We do receive things that warrant the involvement of law enforcement. And fortunately, we've built some great relationships with both federal and local law enforcement. And I don't publicize those. And there are specific reasons why, and I don't even really think we need to go into detail. But the answer is yes. The stuff that is where we believe that it requires the involvement of law enforcement, and it is unfortunately not infrequent. It's much more frequent than I would like, sadly. We don't put those on the air, and those go directly to law enforcement. And things sometimes happen as a result of those inquiries that we do. But we keep those off the air. We've got a great bonus show for you today. We will talk about, so there's new battle lines in the conservative fight in the LGBT space, which is pushing into sports and trans kids. Okay, this is the next wave of anti-LGBT activism, and we're going to talk about that. We will also talk about presumably the moving forward of a proposal that would cut food stamp benefits for millions of people, economically disastrous, but forget about that, morally an abomination. And then we will also talk about the misspellings of many of our most famous and high-profile tweeters, people that tweet, and what we can sort of deduce from that. There's been some research done about high-profile misspellings on Twitter, which I think you will find interesting. All of those stories and more on today's bonus show. 2 ways to access it: become a member at www.joinpacman.com or become a patron at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. I would love to see you on the bonus show. If you will not be partaking, then we will have a brand new program for you tomorrow.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.